Hey, welcome. Today, we're going on a pretty incredible journey. We're going to trace the path from this raw black goo that's been buried for millions of years to the very stuff that builds our modern world. This is the amazing story of oil refining, a tale of turning ancient goo into gold. But first, let me ask you something to get your brain working. What could possibly connect your car? A simple aspirin you take for a headache and a colorful Lego brick. I mean, think about it for a second. The answer is, well, it's pretty surprising, and it's at the absolute heart of what we're talking about today. So, did you guess it? The answer is refined crude oil. Yeah, every single one of those things, the car, the painkiller, the toy, it owes its existence to this complex process. So, let's start at the beginning and look at the unbelievable potential that's locked away inside that raw goo. Okay, so what exactly is this stuff? Well, crude oil is a fossil fuel. It's this rich, incredibly complex cocktail of molecules called hydrocarbons, and it's formed from millions of years of heat and pressure cooking the remains of ancient marine life. But here's the thing. In its raw state, it's kind of useless. To unlock all that potential, you have to completely re-engineer it. And that's exactly where the refinery comes in. You should think of it as a massive, high-tech factory, but for molecules. Its entire reason for being is to take that raw crude oil and systematically, step by step, transform it into hundreds of different products that we all rely on every single day, from the fuel in our cars to plastics and so much more. But how did this gigantic industry even start? It wasn't about cars, it wasn't about plastics. It all began with a really simple, universal human need, the desire for light. This was the kerosene revolution. It all kicks off back in 1850. A guy named Samuel Kier figured out how to distill this rock oil into kerosene for lamps. Suddenly, you had a cheap replacement for super expensive whale oil. And that idea just exploded. The first big refinery opened just 6 years later. But then came the real game changers, the automobile, and a brand new process called thermal cracking, which finally allowed refineries to mass produce a once useless byproduct, gasoline. And this highlights a really key theme you see throughout this story. Demand drives innovation. And you know what? Nothing cranked up that demand quite like World War II. That urgent, desperate need for high-performance aviation fuel pushed the industry to its absolute limits and led to a massive technological leap forward, the catalytic refinery. And it's just such a stark contrast to where it all began. I mean, the very first refineries were incredibly simple. They were basically just a single distillation tower. Their goal wasn't high-octane fuel or anything fancy. It was just to heat up crude oil and separate out the kerosene to keep the lights on. So, how in the world did we get from that simple still to the sprawling, futuristic complexes we see today? Let's take a look inside a modern refinery to really understand the molecular engineering at its core. Now, despite how crazy complex they look, all refineries operate on 3 basic principles. It's actually pretty logical. First, you have to separate all the different types of molecules. Then, you convert some of them into more valuable ones. And finally, you treat them to clean them up and get them ready. So, it's just separation, conversion, and treatment. That's the whole game. That first step, separation, is basically like molecular cooking. The crude oil gets heated up until it turns into a vapor. Then that vapor rises up through a giant distillation tower. As it rises, it cools, and different molecules condense back into a liquid at different levels, all based on their weight and boiling point. So the really light stuff like gasoline goes all the way to the top, while the heaviest gunk like asphalt stays way down at the bottom. All right, now for step 2, conversion. And this, folks, is where the real magic happens. See, just separating the oil doesn't give you nearly enough gasoline to meet demand. So refineries use a process called cracking to literally break big, heavy molecules into smaller, much more valuable ones, like gasoline. The old school method, thermal cracking, was kind of like using a sledgehammer, just brute force heat and pressure. But the modern method, catalytic cracking, is more like a surgical scalpel. It uses a catalyst, that's a substance that speeds up a chemical reaction, to precisely rearrange molecules and create really high-quality fuel. And finally, we get to treatment. After the molecules have been sorted and converted, they still need a good cleaning. This final stage is all about removing impurities like sulfur, which is absolutely crucial for meeting modern environmental standards and making sure the final product works exactly like it's supposed to. It's really the final quality control step before everything gets blended and shipped out. And this comparison just shows that evolution perfectly. On one side, you have the simple distillation setup from the early days, and on the other, the modern refinery. This incredibly complex web of interconnected units for separation, conversion, and treatment, all of it optimized to squeeze value out of every single drop of crude oil. So we've seen the process. We know how it works. But what's the real-world impact? The truth is, the output from these massive facilities has fundamentally shaped the world we live in, often in ways we don't even think about. Just think back to that early refinery that was all about making kerosene. For them, gasoline was a dangerous, useless byproduct. I mean, they literally considered it waste and would sometimes just dump it in rivers. But then, the automobile comes along, and suddenly, this useless liquid becomes the most valuable product coming out of the refinery. It completely flipped the entire industry's priorities upside down. And today, a single barrel of crude oil gives us this incredible range of products. Now, transportation fuels are still king. About 45% of a barrel becomes gasoline, another 25% becomes diesel. But I want you to pay close attention to that 12% slice labeled petrochemicals, because that's where the story gets really interesting. And this is why refining is about so much more than just fuel. Those petrochemicals are the hidden building blocks for just countless items in our daily lives. The plastics in our electronics, the fertilizer that grows our food, the fibers in our clothes, even critical medical supplies like IV bags and aspirin, all of them start their journey inside an oil refinery. It's wild. But this story isn't over, not by a long shot. The world is changing, and the refining industry is facing what might be its greatest transformation yet. So let's look ahead to the next chapter, the refinery of tomorrow. You see, for the first time in basically a century, that explosive demand for gasoline and diesel is finally starting to hit a ceiling, and it's all because of the rise of electric vehicles and renewable energy. This presents a massive, almost existential challenge for an industry that was built almost entirely around making transportation fuels. So, historically, a typical refinery might convert, say, 10 to 15% of each barrel of crude into those valuable petrochemicals we just talked about. The rest? Well, that pretty much all became fuel. That was the business model. But check this out. The refinery of the future is flipping that model completely on its head. There are new, highly advanced crude-to-chemicals refineries being designed to convert as much as 40 to 80% of a barrel directly into chemical feedstocks. They're basically transforming themselves from fuel factories into giant chemical plants. And that's not the only strategy on the table. Refiners are adapting in all sorts of ways. They're converting old facilities to produce biofuels from things like used cooking oil. They're investing in green hydrogen to clean up their own processes. They're electrifying their operations to cut emissions. And some are even looking at integrating plastic recycling to create a truly circular system. You know, from a simple still just trying to light the world with kerosene to this complex chemical powerhouse that's now facing a global energy transition, the story of oil refining has always been about adaptation. So I guess the big question now is, can this colossal industry, the one that basically powered the entire 20th century, really reinvent itself for the 21st? Well, only time will tell.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more How Meets History.